23,000 sailors stranded, running out of food, out of water, out of options. The most strategically vital waterway on Earth locked shut. And the most powerful Navy in history launched a mission to break that blockade. Then, in less than 24 hours, that mission stopped. Not because of Iranian missiles, not because of mines in the water. The question is, why? And what actually happened behind closed doors? Because the answer changes everything about what comes next. Welcome to one of the most consequential 48 hours in American foreign policy in a generation. Here is what we know right now. The United States launched a bold naval operation called Project Freedom, a mission to escort stranded civilian ships out of the blockaded Strait of Hormuz. By the next afternoon, that operation was suspended. President Trump announced the pause on Truth Social, citing, quote, great progress toward a final peace agreement with Iran. But three things are not being fully explained in most coverage. First, why did the operation stop so fast? And was it really Iran that forced Washington's hand, or someone else entirely? Second, what is actually inside the one-page peace deal being quietly negotiated right now? And what has America already given up to get there? Third, what happens to those 23,000 stranded sailors, to oil prices, to your cost of living if this deal collapses in the next 72 hours? We cover stories like this before anyone else. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon so you never miss a breaking update. This one is moving fast. Let us start from the beginning, because you need the full picture to understand what is really at stake. On Sunday evening, May 4, 2026, President Donald Trump announced the launch of Project Freedom, a U.S. Navy operation to physically escort commercial ships through the Strait of Hormuz. The strait had been effectively sealed for over 2 months by Iran following the U.S.-Israeli war that began in late February. The mission was framed as a humanitarian imperative. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stood at the White House podium and made it visceral. He said that sailors from 87 nations, nearly 23,000 human beings, were stranded in the Persian Gulf. He called them sitting ducks. He said at least 10 had already died. He used the word rescue. By Monday morning, U.S. warships began moving. The mission was underway. By Tuesday afternoon, it was paused. Trump posted on Truth Social that Project Freedom would be suspended, quote, for a short period of time to see whether or not the agreement can be finalized and signed. He cited progress in peace negotiations and credited a request from Pakistan and other nations. The U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports, however, remains in full effect. In less than 24 hours, one of the most dramatic military operations in recent memory had been put on hold. And the world is still trying to understand exactly what happened. To understand why this moment matters, you need to go back to February 28th, 2026. In the pre-dawn hours of that Saturday, the United States and Israel launched nearly 900 strikes in 12 hours against Iranian military sites, air defenses, nuclear infrastructure, and, critically, Iranian leadership. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. The head of the most powerful theocratic regime in the Middle East, gone. The strikes also hit a girls' school adjacent to a naval base, killing approximately 170 civilians, a moment that hardened Iranian resolve. Iran retaliated immediately and ferociously, launching hundreds of missiles and thousands of drones at U.S. military bases, Gulf state infrastructure, and ships in the Strait of Hormuz. One of Iran's most potent weapons was not a missile. It was geography. The IRGC sealed the strait. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through it flows roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil, and 20% of its liquefied natural gas. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, Qatar, they all export through it. Close it, and you squeeze the global economy like a vice. Iran knew that. They closed it. Fighting continued for weeks. By early April, a ceasefire was brokered by Pakistan. But the ceasefire never resolved the central dispute. The strait remained closed. Iran began charging transit tolls of over $1 million per ship, asserting sovereign control over an international waterway. The U.S. rejected this entirely. Trump then imposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports in mid-April, after peace talks in Islamabad collapsed without agreement. That stalemate led to Project Freedom. And Project Freedom led to this moment. Remember what Rubio said on Monday? That those sailors were left for dead? That the mission was a matter of life or death? Here is what we now know, and it is more complicated than that statement suggests. Because the question of who actually killed Project Freedom may not have an Iranian return address. 5 individuals are driving this crisis more than any others. Donald Trump. The American president remains the central variable. He launched the war, he launched the blockade, he launched Project Freedom, and he suspended it, all within roughly 70 days. His decision-making is fast, often public, and frequently surprises his own advisors. He has called for Iran's unconditional surrender, and in the same breath called their latest peace proposal better than expected. He is simultaneously the most aggressive and most transactional actor in this equation. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are serving as Trump's back-channel negotiators, working directly and through intermediaries on a 1-page memorandum of understanding with Iranian officials. These are the 2 men who may actually produce a deal. Neither holds an official diplomatic title that matches the weight of what they are negotiating. Mujtaba Khamenei is the new Supreme Leader of Iran, the son of the man America helped kill. He was injured in the same strikes that killed his father. He has made no public appearances. He is a cipher. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian met with him Thursday and described the encounter as sincere and humble. But the world knows almost nothing about what this man actually thinks or what he will accept. Mohammed Ghalibaf, the Iranian parliament speaker, has been Tehran's top negotiator. He publicly mocked Project Freedom, calling it Operation Trust Me Bro. He is the voice of Iran's harder line in these negotiations. And the fact that he is the lead negotiator rather than a foreign minister tells you something about Iran's posture. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif is the indispensable middleman, the broker carrying proposals between Washington and Tehran. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is also playing a critical but opaque role. While diplomats talk, real people are suffering. Roughly 23,000 sailors from dozens of countries remain stranded on vessels in the Persian Gulf and surrounding waters. These are merchant mariners, cargo crew, tanker operators, supply ship workers, caught in a geopolitical conflict they have nothing to do with. They have been running low on food, water, and medical supplies. At least 10 have died. These are not statistics. They are human beings from India, the Philippines, Pakistan, Greece, and dozens of other nations. Their families waiting with no information about when they might come home. Oil prices surged when Iran closed the strait and have stayed elevated. American consumers are paying roughly 50% more for gasoline than they were before the war began. That is not an abstraction. That is real money out of real household budgets every single week. In Iran, the picture is grim. The U.S. blockade is strangling the economy. Energy Secretary Chris Wright confirmed that the blockade is having a severe impact on Iran's oil sector. Before the war, Iran reportedly had roughly 13 days of domestic oil storage capacity. With exports cut off, Iranian oil fields may be forced to shut down, risking permanent infrastructure damage that could take years to reverse. Ordinary Iranian citizens who had nothing to do with their government's decisions are bearing much of that cost. On Thursday, a Chinese-owned oil tanker came under attack near the Strait of Hormuz, the first such attack on a Chinese-flagged vessel since the conflict began. A fire broke out on the ship's deck. China remains a major buyer of Iranian oil and has been watching this crisis with increasing alarm. But here is the part most outlets are not talking about, and it changes the entire story of why Project Freedom really stopped. If you are finding this coverage valuable, subscribe now. We are about to get to the most important part of this story. The world did not stay quiet. Pakistan's Prime Minister Sharif publicly thanked Trump for pausing Project Freedom, crediting Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman as a key voice in convincing the president to stand down. That public acknowledgement was significant. It told the world that Gulf Arab states played a direct role in pulling back an American military operation. France sent its aircraft carrier, the Charles de Gaulle, toward the southern Red Sea as part of a multinational initiative involving more than 40 nations aimed at restoring navigation in the Hormuz region, but emphasized that its movement was separate from U.S. military operations. Paris is hedging. It wants to be present without being seen as Washington's junior partner in an operation that its own allies view with deep unease. China ordered its firms to ignore U.S. sanctions on Iran and is watching the attack on its oil tanker with alarm. Beijing has enormous economic skin in this game. It is one of Iran's largest oil customers, and every day the strait stays closed costs it billions. Iran's parliament speaker mocked the pause openly. Russia welcomed the broader ceasefire and expressed hope that this would somehow free up attention for its own war. Spain's Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, was blunter than most European leaders. He said the world should not applaud those who, quote, set the world on fire just because they show up with a bucket. The United Nations has been largely sidelined. The action is happening in back channels, through Pakistan, through Saudi Arabia, through direct envoy meetings in Islamabad and potentially Geneva. Multilateral institutions have almost no leverage here. Here is what most of the coverage is glossing over. NBC News reported, citing 2 U.S. officials, that Saudi Arabia told Washington it would not allow American aircraft involved in Project Freedom to use the kingdom's airspace. The Saudis were reportedly surprised by Trump's Project Freedom announcement and had not been consulted. That is staggering. The United States relies on Saudi bases and Saudi airspace for regional power projection. If Riyadh quietly blocked an American operation, it did not just complicate the mission, it may have made it militarily unviable. A Saudi source close to the government denied the report to AFP. But the denial itself was carefully worded, saying only that the U.S. still has regular access to Saudi bases and airspace, not specifically denying what happened around Project Freedom. If the NBC reporting is accurate, it means Trump announced a major military operation without full buy-in from the allies it depended on. That is not a diplomatic setback. That is a strategic miscalculation, and it means the great progress on peace talks framing may partly be a face-saving narrative to explain an operation that had already hit a wall before Iran fired a single shot. Meanwhile, there is a second hidden layer. The one-page peace deal currently being negotiated reportedly defers nuclear talks entirely. Iran's proposal calls for ending the war, opening the strait, lifting the blockade and sanctions, and paying reparations, with nuclear discussions postponed. The U.S. initially demanded a comprehensive package, missiles, proxies, nuclear program, and the strait all resolved together. Now analysts are saying Washington has implicitly accepted Iran sequencing. War ends first, nuclear issue later. That is a massive diplomatic concession that has received almost no attention in mainstream coverage. Some U.S. officials are privately skeptical a deal gets done at all. And the window, according to those same officials, may be closing faster than the optimistic public statements suggest. Subscribe if you haven't yet. The next two segments cover what happens if this fails and what the experts are actually saying behind closed doors. Let us be precise about what is at risk here. The Strait of Hormuz handles roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day. Energy that heats homes, powers factories, and runs transportation networks across Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Every day it stays partially or fully closed, the global economy absorbs a body blow. Oil prices stay elevated, food prices follow, shipping costs rise across every supply chain. If the peace deal collapses, the U.S. faces a choice with no good options. Resuming Project Freedom without Saudi airspace access or without broader Gulf cooperation would be far more costly and dangerous than the original announcement suggested. Resuming military strikes on Iran would risk reigniting a full-scale war that the ceasefire has only paused, not ended. Iran still has mines in the water. Reportedly, Iranian forces have lost track of some of them, making the strait genuinely hazardous for any vessel. Iran's economy is being strangled, but an economically desperate Iran with a new, untested supreme leader and a hardline parliament speaker at the negotiating table is not necessarily a compliant Iran. Desperate regimes sometimes escalate rather than capitulate. Iran still has ballistic missile capabilities, proxy forces across the region, and the ability to make any resumption of the conflict extremely costly. The attack on a Chinese oil tanker Thursday introduces another wild card. If Beijing concludes its interests are being directly threatened, the diplomatic calculation changes. China has significant economic leverage over Iran through its oil purchases, but it also has deep resistance to any outcome that reinforces American dominance over a key maritime choke point. For the 23,000 sailors still stranded, their fate is entirely contingent on whether a deal is reached. No deal means no safe passage. No safe passage means more deaths. Analysts are watching this with a mix of cautious optimism and sharp skepticism. On the diplomatic side, the fact that a one-page memorandum of understanding is being actively negotiated is considered genuine progress. The framework, end the war, open the strait, begin a 30-day period of detailed talks on nuclear issues and sanctions, is seen as achievable in principle. The nuclear enrichment moratorium under discussion reportedly ranges from 12 to 15 years, with Iran initially proposing 5 and the U.S. demanding 20. The gap is real, but not impossible to bridge. What analysts flag as the core danger is the internal division within Iranian leadership. The new Supreme Leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, has not been seen publicly. Iranian President Pezeshkian can express willingness to deal, but he does not have final authority. The IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards who control the strait, and the proxies operate with significant autonomy. A deal signed by one part of the Iranian government could be undermined by another. On the American side, the sequencing concession, accepting that nuclear talks happen separately after the war formally ends, has drawn private criticism from officials who believe it sacrifices long-term nonproliferation objectives for short-term tactical relief. If Iran gets the war formally ended and sanctions lifted in Phase 1, what leverage does Washington have to compel compliance in Phase 2? Former Secretary of State John Kerry has compared the difficulty of these negotiations to the poison chalice metaphor, the situation where every choice carries its own costs. There is no clean win here for any party. The question is whether the least bad outcome can be formalized before the fragile ceasefire collapses entirely. Remember the question we started with? Why did Project Freedom really stop? Here is what we now know, and it is more complicated than the official explanation. Saudi Arabia may have blocked American aircraft. Iran's leadership is fractured. And the nuclear question has been quietly kicked down the road in a way that no official has publicly acknowledged. 3 scenarios are plausible from this point forward, based on the current trajectory. Best case, the 1-page memorandum of understanding is signed within the next week, as Trump has suggested is possible. Both sides begin a 30-day structured negotiation. The U.S. naval blockade and Iran's Strait restrictions are gradually lifted in parallel. The 23,000 stranded sailors go home. Oil prices begin to fall. The nuclear question enters a formal process. This is the optimistic scenario, and it requires Iranian factional divisions to be managed, Saudi and Gulf state buy-in to be secured, and Trump's diplomatic patience, which has already been tested, to hold. Likely case, a partial deal is reached that ends formal hostilities and produces some mechanism for limited strait passage, but the nuclear question is deferred indefinitely, sanctions relief is partial, and the underlying tensions remain unresolved. Both sides declare partial victory. The Strait operates at reduced capacity under some form of joint monitoring. The global economic hit continues at a lower level. This outcome prevents immediate catastrophe, but plants the seeds of a future confrontation. Worst case, the deal collapses. An Iranian faction, likely the IRGC, rejects or violates the terms. The U.S. resumes military pressure. Saudi Arabia and Gulf states, caught between Washington and Tehran, further restrict American access to bases and airspace. China escalates its economic pushback after the tanker attack. Oil prices spike to historic levels. The 23,000 sailors remain stranded, and the world edges toward a second, more dangerous phase of a conflict that the ceasefire only paused. The next 72 hours are determinative. Now we want to hear from you. Here is the question that no diplomat will answer publicly. Has America already made its most critical concession? By accepting that the nuclear issue gets resolved later, separate from the immediate deal, has Washington handed Tehran a strategic win that will define the next decade of Middle East security? And the second question, if you were stranded on one of those 23,000 sailors' ships right now, what would you think about the fact that 2 countries are haggling over enrichment timelines while you run out of water? Tell us in the comments, do you think this deal gets done in the next week? Or does the whole thing fall apart? We read every comment on this channel, and we will feature the best responses in our next update. 3 things to take away from everything we covered today. First, Project Freedom was paused, not ended. The U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports remains in full force. This is not peace. It is a negotiated pause, and a fragile one. Second, the deal being negotiated is a 1-page framework that defers the hardest questions, nuclear weapons, missile programs, proxy forces, into a 30-day follow-on process. The core tension between Washington and Tehran has not been resolved. It has been postponed. Third, the hidden players matter as much as the visible ones. Saudi Arabia's role in blocking or limiting American operational capacity. China's reaction to its first tanker attack, the fractured Iranian leadership under a new supreme leader no one has seen. These are the variables that will determine whether this diplomatic pause becomes a lasting peace or the quiet before a second storm. Watch the next 72 hours. That is when we will know whether Witkoff and Kushner have pulled off the most unlikely diplomatic deal in a generation, or whether the ceasefire collapses and the world faces something far worse. This story is not over. In fact, what happens in the next 72 hours could change everything. Subscribe to this channel and hit the bell, because when it breaks, we will be the first to cover it. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide. Right now, the entire world is trying to squeeze through it.